This is a special edition of Macro Voices with hedge fund manager Eric Townsend, the premier financial podcast targeting professional finance, high net worth individuals, family offices, and other sophisticated investors. Now, for this special edition of Macro Voices, here's hedge fund manager Eric Townsend.
Macro Voices All-Stars episode 54 was recorded on September 9th, 2019. I'm Eric Townsend. Professor Steve Keen is back with us today, and Steve prepared an excellent set of charts to accompany today's interview. You can find the download for the chart book next to Steve's picture on our homepage at macrovoices.com. Steve, over this past weekend, China announced that effective next week, they're going to be cutting their required reserve ratio, which is the percentage of assets that banks have to actually have real money to back the loans that they make. Now, forgive my perhaps naive ignorance here, but it seems to me, Steve, if what you're concerned about is you think that maybe there's some storm clouds on the economic horizon and you wanted to make the banking system stronger, what you would do is increase reserve requirements to make absolutely certain that the banking system is sound and can get through the next crisis. On the other hand, if you're convinced the banking system is going to fail and you want to delay that event, you would reduce reserve requirements in order to delay the inevitable. Now, it's admittedly cynical, but why would China suddenly reduce the percentage of reserves that the banking system needs to have? And I know the answer is to supposedly make the economy better and stimulate lending. But why would you stimulate lending when you've got what a lot of people think is really, really excessive credit in the Chinese system that's probably going to lead to a crisis someday anyway? Is this just making the problem worse?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it doesn't just only disturb me, it disappoints me because I thought there was a bit more sense in the Chinese system than you find in the West, because a lot of the economists who run central banks in the West, and certainly this involves people who are on the board of the Federal Reserve, for example, they have this textbook model they were taught at university that bank lending is controlled by a combination of what they call the required reserve ratio, which is what we're talking about here, the percentage of assets that have to be held relative to the level of deposits in the banking system, and the injections of reserves by the central bank into the economy. I think that the combination of those two mean that the government is actually in control of the amount of money in existence, because if you pump in an extra, say, trillion US dollars, that's US dollars of people's minds to get around it more easily than renminbi, pump a trillion in, and and then you have a reserve ratio of 20%, which is what the Chinese used to have. That'll create 5 trillion additional money. That is a textbook model which is simply wrong, because it has this vision of banks levering up the amount of state-created money in the lending process. So somebody deposits, you go into a bank, you deposit, this the whole lot in $1 trillion in. The bank hangs on to 20% of that, which is 200 billion, lends out the 800 billion, et cetera, et cetera. It's a nice little textbook model, but it doesn't at all describe how banks actually operate, because you simply cannot lend from reserves. And the reason is reserves are an asset on your bank balance. If you want to increase the amount of lending you're doing, you've got to increase your liabilities, which are your deposits. If you try to lend out of reserves, that means reducing reserves. At the same time, you've got to reduce your liabilities at the same point. So it simply doesn't work that way, and it just disturbs me, frankly, that the Chinese authorities are falling for this same nonsense textbook explanation of how banks operate that's commonplace in the West. But the real motive, as you say, behind it is they are seeing a decline in the rate of growth of credit in China. And really, since the financial crisis, China's been relying upon enormous levels of credit to stimulate the economy. To give you an idea of just how big those credit levels are, the peak level of credit, which I would describe as the annual change in private debt in America, was 15% of GDP. Just before the financial crisis began, about 2006, it fell to -5 during the crisis itself. China, at the time of the global financial crisis, is running at 20% of GDP. It started to head down as well in the aftermath of the crisis. But the Chinese government basically told banks to go and lend to anybody with a pulse, and particularly then to the commercial sector. And credit in China, rather than continuing to fall during the financial crisis, went from 16% of GDP at the end of 2009 to 40%, 30 or 39% of GDP in 2010. And that's what this huge, we all know about the ghost cities and stuff, things like that in China, the enormous levels of private sector speculative investment. That was the peak. It's now fallen from that down to about 15% and heading down. I think the Chinese are trying to reverse it by this policy, but it simply won't work. So to me, the real worry is not, the reserve ratio. It's the collapse in credit that is gathering pace in China. They're trying to stop it. But if you do that, of course, you get a higher and higher level of private debt, which is already astronomical anyway.
Okay, so too much private debt, what seems to me like desperate measures to try to stimulate lending at a time when it may not really be healthy for the economy to try to stimulate lending. What I want to focus on, though, Steve, is how far can this go? Because something that I've certainly learned, particularly about the U.S. market, and it's a different equation in the U.S. with the U.S. dollar still serving as the world's global reserve currency. I would have said years ago there's no way that the U.S. could continue doing its quantitative easing and deficit spending and all these things. Eventually it would all come to a head and blow up. Well, it hasn't yet, and I'm still convinced that it will someday, but it takes a lot longer than I ever expected for these things really to come to a head and blow up, at least in the U.S., which is the reserve currency issuer. Is the calculus different for China? Is there a greater risk here? Or is this something that, even if you and I don't approve of it, might go on for another 10 years?
You can go on forever. I mean, so long as you're running a trade surplus, this is the reason that China can keep on doing it. The capacity of the central bank to create money is unlimited. It's a question of what happens with the money once it's been created as to what occurs next. So if you have, in America, you create, as the Federal Reserve was during QE, $1 trillion of new money every year, and that money then goes into the financial sector because when they buy the bonds off the public, they're actually buying it off the financial sector. So the financial sector gets $1 trillion in cash. Of course, cash doesn't earn a return, so they then use that cash to buy other assets, in particular shares. Now, of course, when you buy the shares, if you've created the additional money in the reserves, this is what QE does. QE boosts the reserves of the banking system by $1 trillion because the Federal Reserve's done an asset swap of buying bonds off the financial sector and putting cash into circulation in their bank accounts. That creates $1 trillion of additional reserves. When the financial sector then spends that trillion, it doesn't change the reserves one iota because they buy it of other people who also have bank accounts. The bank accounts are matched by the reserves. The increase in deposits causes an increase in reserves. There's no change. So what it causes is a sort of churning of money into the financial sector in terms of additional buying of shares and so on, but it doesn't alter the amount of reserves in existence. Now, we saw the Federal Reserve doing that $80 billion worth of buying of bonds every month, basically $1 trillion a year, pretty much for a decade. And they can keep on doing it indefinitely in America's case without worrying about what that does with the trade deficit, because as the international currency, people still need American dollars, even if America's running a huge trade deficit. But in the case of a country like China, it can do the same thing so long as it doesn't affect its currency valuation, which means it can't, if it was running a trade deficit, then it would need to be issuing bonds in terms of American dollars to actually buy American or foreign capital goods to keep itself going. Because it's running a trade surplus, it doesn't need to do that. So it's equally got a capacity to keep on doing this indefinitely, so long as it runs a trade surplus. And of course, the same thing applies to China, to Japan as applies to China. And they've been doing this government stimulus stuff now for 25 years.
Steve, is it possible that what we're actually seeing here is a form of negotiating tactic where China is saying to President Trump, look, you want to play hardball? We're going to reduce our reserve ratio, which is going to further have the effect of eventually weakening our currency, which is the last thing that you, President Trump, want to see happen. Could it be that that's been a motivator of this?
If it is, it's going to be an ineffective motivator because, again, the amount of reserves doesn't affect the amount of lending. This is and particularly you don't want to have the additional lending anyway because China's already carrying, compared to America, China's private debt level now is about 205% of GDP. America's 150%. Its level's coming down. They're trying to increase it by increasing credit, but you just don't want a more indebted private sector because that makes your economy more fragile, not stronger. So I I think it's just because they're worried about the decline in credit demand and they're trying to stimulate it, but they're using a textbook model which won't work. So I think this is a sign that where we tend to normally talk about the Chinese playing a long game, the old joke about Chow En-lai being asked what he thought about Western civilization and said he thought it would be a good idea. This implies a level of wisdom that, unfortunately, when China looks, it's on the same part of the wisdom in America. They don't understand the financial system. They're trying to stimulate it in a way that won't work.
Steve, let's turn this around to the investor's perspective. For international investors, what could the consequences and ramifications of this be? It sounds like you don't think that this reserve requirement reduction has any immediate risk of, blowing anything up. So how should investors be thinking about this?
Well, I think your point about if you're doing it, it's a sign of you being worried about the fragility of your system rather than actually making the fragility worse. One thing reserves do is give you a cash buffer that if anything goes wrong with your other investments, your cash won't fall in value all that much. But if you reduce the reserve ratio, then more of the assets you're going to have as a bank are going to be risky assets. And therefore, if there is a decline in the stock market or a fall in bond values and so on, your assets fall faster in value than if you have a higher reserve ratio. You're therefore more fragile. So I think this is a sign that the Chinese are trying to continue the banking sector lending even though its asset mix is not healthy. Let's go for an unhealthier still mix and keep the game going for longer. So I think it's more of a worry about not right now, but in a couple of years' time, the Chinese financial sector having more bank failures because they're being allowed to operate more irresponsibly.
Okay, Steve, let me turn this around. If the Chinese are trying to stimulate their economy, which is clearly the case, and their concern is collapsing credit, what should they be doing if not reducing the reserve rate?
China, I think, is the ideal country to try an idea that I've been putting forward for a decade now, and that is what I call a modern debt jubilee. Because the problem is, the reason that credit demand is falling is that there's too much private debt and people are carrying too much, don't want to carry any more. In particular, the corporate sector is deleveraging in China right now. If you want to encourage them to borrow again, to finance investment by borrowing, then you've got to reduce the debt burden. And the simple way to do that is, just as QE's creating money out of nothing by the Federal Reserve and handing it to the financial sector, you could do what I call QE for the people, or modern debt jubilee, and create money that goes into people's bank accounts on a per capita basis across all of China, and say, okay, if you've got debt, you've got to reduce your debt level. If you don't have debt, you've got to buy, in this case, let's say corporate shares, which have been issued specifically to reduce corporate debt. You'd therefore reduce the household debt burden, reduce the corporate debt burden, turn a lot of the corporate debt into equity, increase the ownership of Chinese, across the whole Chinese population of shares, so you make the country more fundamentally capitalist, more with an interest in corporations performing, and reduce the debt burden at the same time, just by effectively what is an accounting trick. It's the same accounting trick the Feds use for QE, but using it to stimulate the economy more directly instead. That's what they could do. That'd work. That'd reduce the debt burden and enable more investment by Chinese corporations as well. But it looks like the textbook is strangling sensible thinking by the Chinese central bank as much as it does by the Federal Reserve.
Well, Steve, I can't tell you how much we appreciate another fantastic interview. We look forward to getting you back on in a couple of weeks for another update. And listeners, stay tuned to Macro Voices this week. We've got a whole bunch of more exciting content coming up for you the rest of this week. For the Macro Voices Podcast Network, I'm Eric Townsend.
That concludes this edition of Macro Voices. Be sure to tune in each week to hear feature interviews with the brightest minds in finance and macroeconomics. Please register your free account at macrovoices.com. Once registered, you'll receive our free weekly Research Roundup email containing links to supporting documents from our featured guests and the very best free financial content our volunteer research team could find on the internet each week. You'll also gain access to our free research library. And the more registered users we have, the more we'll be able to recruit high-profile feature interview guests for future programs. So please register your free account today at macrovoices.com if you haven't already. You can subscribe to Macro Voices on iTunes to have Macro Voices automatically delivered to your mobile device each week, free of charge. Macro Voices is presented for informational and entertainment purposes only. The information presented on Macro Voices should not be construed as investment advice. Always consult a licensed investment professional before making investment decisions. The views and opinions expressed on Macro Voices are those of the participants and do not necessarily reflect those of the show's hosts or sponsors. Macro Voices, its producers, sponsors, and hosts, Eric Townsend, shall not be liable for losses resulting from investment decisions based on information or viewpoints presented on Macro Voices.